The cheapest thing in the world to underestimate is an old man who still ties his own dock lines. My son-in-law spent the better part of 4 years making that mistake, and not once did I correct him. That part was deliberate. My name is Malcolm Frears, and I've spent most of my life in Mahone Bay, on the south shore of Nova Scotia, where the fog comes in off the water like it's paying rent. On the third Saturday of October 2 years ago, I was at my kitchen table, in an old shirt I should have thrown out a decade back, drinking coffee gone lukewarm, watching the wind push the boats around in the harbour. Ordinary morning, the kind I've earned. My daughter was there, which was its own kind of weather. She'd driven up from Halifax with her husband, and the two of them came in smelling like the city and a strong opinion. He set a folder on the table beside my mug. Careful, the way you set down something you've rehearsed. Just some paperwork to make life easier for you, Malcolm, he said. He always called me Malcolm. Never Dad, never even Mal. He'd say my full name like it was a line item. I looked at the folder, a law firm's letterhead, one of those Halifax outfits with 3 names and a harbor view. My son-in-law slid it the half-inch closer that people slide things when they want you to pick them up. We just want to protect everything you and Mom built, my daughter said, and she wouldn't quite meet my eyes when she said it, and I noted that the way I note everything. I've always noted everything. It's the only talent I've ever had worth a damn. What is it? I said. Not really a question. A restructuring, he said. We'd fold the boatworks and the property into a family holding company. Cleaner for the estate. I'd handle the management side so you don't have to think about any of it. He smiled the smile he used on bankers. You've done enough thinking. You should be out on the water. I opened it right there at the table. 11 pages. My daughter's signature already on the back, and a spot flagged with one of those little plastic arrows for mine. I read it slow because reading slow makes people nervous, and somewhere around page 6 I found the line. My personal assets, it said, were to be treated as legacy holdings of nominal residual value. Nominal. Residual. They'd run the numbers on a man they'd never bothered to ask. Something settled in my chest, not anger. Something cleaner than anger. Clarity has a temperature, and it runs cold. Welcome to Dad's cold revenge. Pour yourself something, because this one takes the long way around, and the long way is the only road I know. If you've got a minute, tell me in the comments which harbor you're watching from, hit that subscribe button, and stick with me. The slow ones are always worth it. But this doesn't start at that kitchen table. It starts about 9 years before, on a gray afternoon in early March, when my daughter first brought him home to meet her mother and me. He shook my hand too hard, the way men do when they've read a book about it. He was sharp, I'll give him that. Quick with a number, quicker with a compliment, the kind of fellow who remembers what you ordered last time and reminds you he remembers. He had a small development company then, 3 condo projects in Dartmouth, and a lot of plans drawn up bigger than his bank account. My wife liked him. She liked everybody. That was her trouble and her grace. Here's what he figured he knew about his father-in-law. Retired boat fellow. Owns a shop down by the water that smells like resin and diesel. Drives a 15-year-old truck. Wears the same 3 flannel shirts. Drinks his coffee black at the same Tim Hortons on the way to the marina every morning, same as he has since the building went up. A simple man with a simple life and, he assumed, a simple little pile of money. Here's what was actually true. 11 years before he ever shook my hand, I'd quietly sold a marine electronics company I'd built up over 2 decades. Sonar and navigation gear, the unglamorous stuff that keeps fishing boats off the rocks, to a private equity outfit out of Calgary, for a figure my accountant still lowers his voice to say. There was no press release. I didn't change my truck. I didn't change my shirts. I came home, took my wife out for fish and chips at the place by the wharf, and the next morning I went down to the boatyard and swept the floor, because I like sweeping the floor and because the floor doesn't care what you're worth. Money that announces itself is money that attracts the wrong company. I learned that watching better men than me get hollowed out by people who smelled it on them. So I put it where money goes quiet, numbered companies, and if you're Canadian you know exactly the kind, the ones with a string of digits and an ink that nobody ever looks at twice. I held land. I held positions in companies my son-in-law would have killed to get a meeting with. I held it all so plainly that nobody ever thought to look. The boatyard, the one everybody figured was my whole world. I kept it because I loved the smell of it. It was the smallest thing I owned. It just happened to be the only thing anybody could see. So when he put that folder on my table and called my life's work nominal and residual, I didn't argue. I closed it, and I said I'd want to look it over with my own fellow before I signed anything, and I watched my daughter's shoulders drop a quarter inch, and I watched him watch her, and I understood that this had been her job, to bring the old man around, and she'd just failed it. And now there'd be a conversation in the truck on the drive back to the city that I wasn't meant to hear. No rush, he said, standing all warmth. Anytime this month. This month, I said. Sure. They left. The folder sat on my table for a while, and I sat there with it, and outside the fog came in and took the far shore the way it does. I knew the document wasn't the start of anything. A document is the end of something. It's the part where the careful people finally feel safe enough to put it in writing. The start was earlier, and I went looking for it the way you go looking for a leak. Patiently, on your hands and knees, following the water back to where it gets in. I found it on a Sunday, the second Sunday of November, with the rain hammering the windows and the wood stove ticking. We'd set up one of those shared family drives a few years back, for photos mostly, my late wife's idea so the grandkids could send things. I was hunting for the survey on the boatyard land for the very lawyer my son-in-law had recommended, of all people, and I took a wrong turn into a folder he'd put on there himself, one of his project folders, and tucked inside it, plain as a hymn, was a file called Transition, South Shore. My first thought, and I remember it exactly, was, that's an awful lot of work to put into ruining a Sunday. I opened it. Then I read it again because the first time my eyes kept sliding off it the way they do off bad news. 14 pages. My family laid out like a parcel of land waiting for rezoning. There was a timeline. Year 1, establish the holding company, secure the father-in-law's signature on consolidation. Year 2, fold the boatworks, listed as a non-core asset. Year 3, decommission the marine operation and apply to rezone the waterfront for residential. 40 units, the note said. Premium harbour front. There was a yield projection. There was a phrase, late in the document, that I've thought about more than I'd like to admit. Managing the father-in-law's expectations through this period will require the daughter's continued involvement. The daughter, my daughter. Her involvement. Written down by her husband like she was a department. And on page 9, a name. A financier out of Halifax, a man named Trevor Lund, listed as the bridge lender and equity partner for the rezoning play. I'd met Trevor Lund. He'd come to my late wife's funeral, of all the gall, shaken my hand at the reception, and held it a beat too long and called me Chief. Chief. Stood there in my own grief and sized up my waterfront over the egg sandwiches. I closed the laptop. I went out to the kitchen and I made a pot of soup because some things you can't think your way through standing still. And a pot of soup gives your hands an honest job while your head does the dishonest one. And standing at that stove, I understood the thing that was actually worse than any of it. They hadn't underestimated me by accident. They'd chosen me for it. A quiet old widower who swept his own floor, who never bragged, who'd buried his wife and gone soft with grief. I was the perfect place to hide a plan. Easy to manage, easy to flatter, easy to wait out, because how many good years could the old man have left? I wasn't a father in that document, I was a holding period, and the hardest part, the part I sat with longest, was that they were right about every visible thing. I was quiet, I was grieving. I did love them, and they knew it, and they'd built the whole plan on the love like it was load-bearing. What they never thought to ask was what a man who'd spent 40 years reading the water does when he sees the tide turning against him. They figured I'd gone soft. Grief had made me slow, sure. It hadn't made me stupid. It had made me cold, and cold lasts longer than anything. That night my daughter texted me a photo of the grandkids in their Halloween costumes, and a little heart, and, "Love you, Dad, talk soon." I texted back the heart. Then I sat in the dark a while. Here's what people get wrong about a long game. They think it's about hating somebody enough to wait. It isn't. Hate burns hot and burns out. What I had was colder than hate, and it never once flickered. The first call I made wasn't to a lawyer. It was to an old friend named Doug Pelletier, who'd handled my company's affairs since before I had any worth handling, a man who looks like he lost an argument with a snowblower and has the sharpest legal mind on the Atlantic coast. "Doug," I said, "I need you to come up to the bay. It's November, Malcolm. The drive's a misery. Bring the misery," I said, "and bring a notepad." He came up 2 days later, stamping snow off his boots, holding a double-double he'd let go cold on the highway. He sat at the same table where the folder had been. "Talk," he said. So I did, all of it. The man at the funeral, the folder, the 14 pages, the line about my daughter's continued involvement. Doug doesn't interrupt, which for Doug is a held breath. When I finished, he set down his coffee and looked at the ceiling for a long minute. He wrote it down, he said finally. 14 pages. That's either very confident or very dumb. It's both, I said. Which is exactly what we're going to use. He picked up his pen. What do you want, Malcolm? You say the word and I'll have the RCMP and a judge looking at this man's business by spring. You could end him. I'd thought about that. I'd thought about it for a week of bad sleep. And I'd put it down, because ending a man fast just lets him keep his story. He'd tell people the in-laws turned on him, the bitter old father-in-law, and my daughter would believe it because believing it would be easier than the truth. No. If I moved fast, she'd be able to call me the villain. I wanted to move slow enough that there'd be no version of events left for anyone to argue with. I don't want to end him, I said. I want to own him. Quietly. From the inside. And I don't want him to know I'm there until the floor's already gone out from under him. Doug looked at me for a long while. Then he did a thing I hadn't seen him do since my wife's wake. He smiled. All right, he said. Let's go fishing. We started that week. The first move was the boring one, and the boring ones always matter most. Doug set up a fresh numbered company in Nova Scotia, the kind of name that's just digits and a comma, the kind that makes a bank clerk's eyes glaze. Boring as camouflage. I learned that on the first company I ever built. The second move was the one that mattered. My son-in-law's development firm was carrying more debt than swagger, and his big new project, a waterfront condo build over in Dartmouth, the one he bragged about at Thanksgiving, was leveraged to the gills, with that same Trevor Lund holding the bridge financing. Bridge loans are short, expensive, and nervous. They come due, and when they do, somebody with cash gets to set the terms. So I went looking quietly through the numbered company and a holding entity behind it, for the position behind the position. Money likes to be paid back. I made it known, through intermediaries who had no idea who they were really working for, that there was patient capital available to take out Trevor Lund's bridge loan when it matured. By the time the snow was off the ground, my numbered company had quietly bought out the loan on my son-in-law's flagship project. I now held the note on the very building he was using to impress people. He had no idea. He sent me a Christmas card with the kids on it. I sent one back, with a chickadee on it, because my wife always bought the chickadee ones and I had a drawer full. People expect me to tell them I went cold to my daughter's face. That I stopped calling, stopped showing up. I didn't. I drove down for the grandkids' hockey on Saturday mornings. I fixed the loose board on her back step in April. I sat through Sunday dinners and asked my son-in-law about his projects with what I'm told was convincing interest. Because the moment I changed, the moment either of them felt the temperature shift, the whole thing would have come apart and my daughter could read a room better than her mother ever could. So I gave her nothing to read. I smiled. I passed the potatoes. And every Tuesday I drove into Halifax to a small office Doug kept, paid for through a company nobody could trace, and there I took the thing they were building and I started, very gently, taking it apart. Nobody ever said revenge has to look like revenge. Sometimes it looks exactly like a grandfather flooding a backyard rink in January. I'll be honest with you about something, because this isn't only a story about being clever, and if I tell it like it is, you'll trust the part where it gets cold. There were nights, more than I'll say. I'd sit by the wood stove with a glass of Crown Royal I never drank, just held, the way you hold a thing for the warmth of holding it, and I'd feel something I didn't have a clean word for. Not rage, closer to grief, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't knock. I'd raised that girl, taught her to splice a line and gut a mackerel, and stand up to the bank. I'd walked her down the aisle to that man. And somewhere in there, she'd sat across a table from him and helped write the words my daughter's continued involvement and decided her own father was a problem to be managed. There was one night, late February, the worst storm of the winter, the power flickering and the harbor gone white with it. I sat in the dark with that glass, and the full weight of it landed all at once. Not the plan, not the money, just the plain stupid fact that I'd watched her come down the stairs in her mother's dress, and thought I was the luckiest man on the coast. I'd wanted it to be real. Even after the folder, even after the funeral handshake, some foolish part of me had wanted to be wrong. I sat with that about 10 minutes. Then I poured the rye down the sink, rinsed the glass, banked the stove, and went to bed. The next morning I drove into the city in a foot of fresh snow and kept building. Because wanting a thing to be different and letting it wreck you are two separate choices, and I'd already made mine. That spring I went after the supply side, Because a developer is only as strong as the people who pour his concrete and frame his walls. Two of the contractors my son-in-law leaned on hardest were small outfits running thin, both quietly looking for a partner with deeper pockets. One out near Truro, one in the valley. I bought into both. Not loud, not controlling. Just enough of a seat at the table that when their crews got booked and their prices firmed up, the people setting those prices answered, 4 layers removed, to me. He started complaining at Sunday dinner that his trades were getting expensive and unreliable. I told him that was a real shame and passed him the gravy, and I'll admit that the gravy tasted a little better than usual. Then in early summer, Doug called on a Thursday with no hello. Trevor Lund, he said. I set my coffee down. Go. He runs a private fund on the side. Small. He's quietly raising a second one, looking for an anchor investor to make it look serious. How much to anchor? Couple million. He'd take a smaller check from the right name. Then we'll be the right name, I said. Arm's length, Doug. 3 companies deep at least. The man cannot ever know it's me. Malcolm, he called you chief at your wife's funeral. I let that sit. Make it 4 companies deep, I said. By the first frost, I was the silent anchor in Trevor Lund's fund. The man who'd held my son-in-law's debt, the man who'd sized up my waterfront over funeral sandwiches, was now in business with the chief he'd never bothered to read. Take a second with that one. I did. If you're still here, do an old fellow a favor. A lot of folks watch the whole way through and never tap the button. It costs you nothing and it means everything down here. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments, would you have moved fast and burned it all down, or would you have done what I did and waited? I'm honestly curious. The slow road isn't for everyone. By the time the next autumn came around, here's what the board looked like, though nobody at any dinner table could see a single piece of it. My numbered company held the note on his flagship building. I held positions in the 2 contractors he couldn't build without. I anchored the fund of the financier he couldn't refinance without. And my son-in-law was having the best year of his career. New project announced. His name in the business pages of the Chronicle Herald. A bigger truck. He stood up at Thanksgiving and gave a little toast to family, to building something that lasts. I raised my glass with everybody else. He was standing on my floor and calling it his house. A full year after the folder landed on my table, almost to the day, mid-October, the leaves turned and the harbor going slate gray, Doug came up to the bay with a banker's box. He set it on the table where the 11 pages had been, careful, like it might go off. This is everything, he said. I read it slow, all of it. The note on the Dartmouth building, fully traceable back to me. My positions in the 2 contractors. My anchor stake in Lund's fund, 4 companies deep and every layer documented. And, just as importantly, a clean print of the transition file off the family drive, dated with the metadata intact, with the line about my daughter's continued involvement sitting there in black and white. His plan had been 14 pages. What I was holding ran to better than 100. He'd come at me with a folder. I'd come back with the whole filing cabinet, the building it was kept in, and the land under that. Send it to his lawyer, I said. Not as a fight, as a notice. I want the senior fellow at that firm to read it twice and then go close his office door. The response came 4 days later, and not from my son-in-law. It came from the senior partner at his Halifax firm, a careful man with 20-some years in commercial work, the kind who's seen everything and says so. Doug told me the call lasted 7 minutes, and the man spoke the way you speak crossing thin ice. The father-in-law's holdings, he said, appeared to be considerably more substantial than his client had understood. Yes, Doug said, they are. His client, the lawyer said, would like to discuss revisiting the restructuring agreement. Doug looked across the desk at me. I shook my head. The terms in that agreement are your client's own words, Doug told him. My client wouldn't change a comma. There was a long silence on the line, the kind that costs money. I see, the lawyer said. I'll be in touch. My daughter came up to the bay that Saturday. Alone. No husband, no kids, no reason given. She came in and stood in the kitchen and didn't take her coat off, and I knew before she said a word, but I didn't let my face know it. You want coffee? I said, Dad. She wouldn't sit. Gerald's lawyer called us last night. I let her use his name. I never did, in my own head. He was the son-in-law, and that's all he'd earned. I filled the kettle, took my time. He says. She stopped. Started again. He says you own the note on the Harborview project, and that you're... Dad, are you the anchor in Trevor Lund's fund? 4 companies deep, I said, and set the kettle on the burner. But yes. She put a hand on the back of a chair like the floor had moved. How long? Since the second Sunday of last November, I said. She closed her eyes, just for a second. Long enough that I could see the arithmetic going on behind them, the same arithmetic I'd watched her mother do, the same arithmetic she'd inherited and used against me. The file, she said quietly. On the drive, the file, I said. The kettle started to mutter. Neither of us moved. You never said anything, she said. Neither did you. That landed. She sat down then, finally, like the legs had been taken out from under her, and for a long moment she just looked at me. Really looked. The way she had when she was small and trying to figure out if I was angry or only tired. How much do you have, Dad? She said, and her voice cracked on it, because it wasn't really a question. It was the sound of a person finding out the ground floor isn't the ground. More than his lawyers thought, I said. More than you thought. A lot more. She put her face in her hands. And here's where I have to be straight with you, because I could pretend I felt nothing, and you'd half believe me, but it wouldn't be true. When she lifted her head, she wasn't the woman who'd helped draft that plan. She was my girl, the one I taught to splice a line, and she was wrecked, and some old useless part of me wanted to cross the kitchen and tell her it was all right. I didn't. Because it wasn't. Why didn't you just say something, she said. Why didn't you just stop us? Tell us no. We're your family. I did tell you no, I said. I told you no the day you decided I was a holding period instead of your father. You just weren't listening, because you'd already done the math and the math said I didn't matter. I turned the burner off. The muttering stopped. The kitchen went very quiet, just the foghorn out past the islands doing its lonesome work. I gave you a whole year, girl, every Saturday, every Sunday dinner. I kept showing up, hoping one of those weeks you'd look at me and remember. You never did. You kept managing me. So I let you keep thinking you were. What do you want? She whispered. What do you actually want, Dad? I thought about the real answer, the one that has nothing to do with land or notes or numbered companies. I'd wanted a daughter who came up the shore road just to see me. I'd wanted Sunday dinners that weren't a job somebody assigned her. I'd wanted, God help me, to grow old being underestimated by people who loved me, instead of by people who'd written me down as residual. But you can't ask for back a thing that was already a performance. Nothing you haven't already offered me, I said. The agreement stands. Your terms, every word. The boat works, the land, all of it exactly the way the two of you wrote it up. I just happen to also own the note on his building, the trades he can't build without, and the fund he can't refinance without. That part you didn't account for, because you never thought to ask what the old man had been doing all those quiet years. She stared at me, waiting for the catch, the cruelty, the part where I twisted the knife. There wasn't one. That was the cruelty, if you want to call it that I'd give them exactly what they asked for, and let the size of what they hadn't asked for do all the talking. You built all of that, she said slowly, while you were fixing my backstep. While you were flooding the kids' rink, I was planning the rest of the harbor, I said, while he was planning to pave mine. She was quiet a long time. Outside, the fog had come all the way in and taken the wharf, the way it does in the late afternoon. Slow, indifferent, covering whatever it touches without asking. When she spoke again, her voice had gone steady, the controlled one, the businesswoman she'd become. We underestimated you, she said. Yes, I said. You did. She nodded once. She got up, and at the door she stopped with her hand on the latch, and for just a second she was 8 years old again and didn't want to go home. Then she went. I heard the car start, heard the tires on the gravel, heard the gravel give way to pavement, and the pavement give way to nothing. I stood at the window a while. It didn't be honest about that, because the videos that tell you it feels like winning are selling you something. It felt like watching a boat you built come off the trailer wrong, and there's nothing left to do but note where the mistake was. I poured a glass of water, drank it standing at the sink. Then I called Doug. She knows, I said. How'd she take it? I thought about it. Like her mother, I said. Right up until she didn't. The rest played out the way these things do, when the math is already settled. The son-in-law's lawyer tried to find a way to call the restructuring void, and Doug pointed out, pleasantly, that his client had drafted it himself, and there's no judge in this country who'll let a man out of a deal because the other fellow turned out to have money. Trevor Lund's second fund collapsed over the winter. When the anchor investor, me, 4 companies deep, declined to add more, the rest of the small money got nervous and walked, the way small money always does. The flagship building got sold off to service the note, and the note holder, a numbered company up the South Shore, was very reasonable about it, which is to say I let him keep his dignity and took everything else. He resigned from a couple of boards. Personal reasons, the notices said. I never made one phone call to make any of it happen. I didn't have to. I just stopped holding things up, and it turned out his whole world had been leaning on me the entire time without either of us saying it out loud. In the spring, the company that had been my son-in-law's flagship development came up for sale outright. The projects, the land assemblies, the lot of it, and the receiver reached out to the largest creditor to see if there was an appetite. The largest creditor was me. Doug forwarded it without a word of advice, which is how Doug tells you what he thinks. I read it twice. I thought about a man holding my hand too long over funeral sandwiches and calling me chief. I thought about 40 premium units planned for the water my father had fished, and his father before him. I called Doug. Tell the receiver I'll take the whole thing, I said. Not a stake, the whole company. And the first thing it's going to do is kill the rezoning. That waterfront stays a working harbor as long as I'm breathing and a good while after. You know she'll see your name on the filing, Doug said. I know. I'd taken a small place down by the water by then, just me, a view of the islands and the fog and the same boats I've watched my whole life pushing against their lines. I stood at the window the night the deal closed with a glass of Crown Royal, and this time I drank it, slow, and I felt something I hadn't felt since before my wife got sick. Not happy, not proud, just still. The way a shop goes still, after the compressor finally shuts off and you realize how loud it had been the whole time you were standing in it. My daughter calls now and then. We're careful with each other. The way you're careful with a boat, you know, has a soft spot in the hull. She brings the grandkids up some Saturdays, and I flood the rink, and we don't talk about any of it, and maybe someday we will. The son-in-law I haven't seen. I'm told he's selling insurance in Moncton. I hope he's good at it. I genuinely do. A man should be good at something honest. Doug asked me once, near the end of it all, sitting on my new dock with 2 cups of bad coffee, whether I was all right, whether it had been worth it. I thought about the night with the rye I poured down the sink, and the storm and the ceiling I'd stared at while the wood stove ticked. I thought about a folder on a kitchen table and a word like nominal sitting in it where my whole life should have been. You want to know the truth, Doug? I said. The fog was lifting off the harbor, slow, taking its time, the way it always has. I'd have given them every last cent, all of it. The whole pile, no strings, if she'd just come up the shore road once to see her old man and not to manage him. I drank my coffee. They never thought to ask for that. They only ever thought to take it. And the thing about a man who spent his whole life being underestimated is that he's had a lot of practice waiting. I set the cup down. I'm all right. I built what I built. I kept what was mine. And I kept the harbor a harbor. That's enough for an old fellow. And the strange part, the part I didn't expect, I meant it.